We can all picture the perfect dynasty team. Mahomes and Allen at quarterback, Jefferson and Chase and Lamb at wide receiver, Bijan and Brees Hall at running back. We have exciting rookies. We have useful pieces on the bench. We have a plethora of future draft picks. We've all imagined it. It sounds amazing, idyllic even. Unfortunately, in 99.9% of dynasty leagues, this ideal is unachievable without years of tanking, flawless drafting, and honestly, a lot of luck. So instead, today we will talk about how to build a perfect dynasty team on a budget, operating within the limitations of a typical dynasty league. How should you allocate your resources to compete for championships year in and year out? Now, if you're new here, you should know that I've already put out a lot of dynasty strategy videos, and today's video will build on some of those ideas. So what I would recommend is pausing this video, going down to the link in the description, watching that playlist from the beginning. It's about an hour of content that gives an entire overview of my dynasty strategy. And while you're doing that, just make sure you hit that subscribe button as well. Okay, now that you're all caught up, we're going to build the perfect dynasty team on a budget. And when I say a budget, what I mean is the overall value of your dynasty team, what you might call trade value. There's no universal perfect way to measure your roster's trade value, but I like Dynasty Daddy's tool, the power rankings tool. You can go to the trade view and you can look at your team in terms of keep, trade, cut value, or my personal preference, their actual ADP value, which is pulled from over 100,000 real drafts. This is a great way to see at a glance how you stack up to your league mates in terms of overall trade value. And it even breaks it down by position: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, and draft picks. So your team at any given time has a certain amount of trade value. But of course, you can increase this value when you hit on breakout players like Kyren Williams, or you trade for a first round pick and you hold it and as it accrues in value. And your trade value can decrease when you draft a rookie like Quentin Johnson who busts in epic fashion, or you hold on to somebody like Austin Eckler for one season too long. But if you think about it, in essence, the game of Dynasty is really just about allocating the trade value that you have in the best possible way across three dimensions. The first way would be positionally, allocating your trade value across quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. That's going to be beyond the scope of our video today. And honestly, it kind of changes year to year as the league reacts to what happened in the previous season. But once you figured that out, you also have time. What is the timeline of your roster? Are you allocating value to compete now, later, or both? You know, you look at a rebuilding team, the advantage of rebuilding is that all of your value is allocated to later. And so you're not sacrificing any value in the current season. And then the last of these three dimensions is definitely the most subjective. It has the most categories, but I would call this asset class. So rather than grouping players by position, here you're grouping players by their archetype. You might have rookie picks, rookies, young elite players, breakout candidates, bench players, productive veterans. There's all these different ways you can categorize players. And I think that this is where dynasty team management tends to go wrong, because I think a lot of managers are prioritizing the wrong player archetypes. They're devoting too much roster value to the wrong asset classes. Now, the last thing we need before we can start building our perfect dynasty team is an actual goal. What is the objective? We know we want to win championships, but that's largely out of our control on a year-to-year basis. So what are we measuring against to know if we're on the right track? Well, if you watched my first dynasty strategy video, I exposed the biggest lie in dynasty, which is this idea of building a super team and that you have to go all in if you want to win the championship. It's not the case. The truth is that we have limited odds of winning in any given season, and that you're better off trying to compete year in and year out rather than going for this constant cycle of rebuilding and going all in. So my goal with any dynasty team that I'm building is to contend for a bye in as many possible seasons while remaining above average in trade value. So we're going to look at one of my dynasty teams that is currently striving towards that goal. It is far from the perfect dynasty team, but I think it incorporates some of the ideas that would lead us to a perfect dynasty team if such a thing existed. Now, just a disclaimer, the ideal strategy for you could vary based on your league settings and the micro economy of your league. Like, there are some sweeping generalizations we can make about what asset classes are valued and how, but the truth is that you're playing against 11 or 13 or 9 other managers, and how they value players should dictate your strategy to some extent. If they undervalue rookies or rookie picks or quarterbacks, you can exploit that edge, and that might change what your optimal strategy is. But this method of team building has worked for me well over a number of different leagues, and I think it's widely applicable. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at this roster. This was a very low value orphan team that I took over 2 seasons ago. We had to do 2 full years of tanking to get to this point, and I am very ready to turn the corner and start competing this season, and I have made deals that I think will allow me to do so. So what I've got here is I've pulled the roster up on Dynasty Daddy, which is going to let us look at the most valuable players on my team, sorted by their ADP value. So right away, you might notice that this is a pretty shallow roster. We get down to some pretty gross players pretty quickly. It's a very studs and duds looking team. That's not really intentional. That's not the point of the video here. I just don't have a lot of depth because, again, there weren't really any valuable assets on this team when I took it over, and I'm still working on building that back up. But there are two intentional choices that I've made with this roster and that I've started to make on a lot more of my rosters that I think make a big difference in keeping your competing window open. And I think adopting these two ideas will have positive results for your dynasty team. So the first of these choices is a de-emphasis on young non-rookie players. I don't say I'm avoiding these players because that's not really true. If I'm getting a good price, I will take on one of these young breakout candidate players and hold on to them and see what happens. But for the most part, what I'm going out and buying are young difference makers. I'm willing to pay that premium for the players that we know are already good. On this roster, you might consider Drake London the lone exception to this rule, but I think he's been in a uniquely bad situation and he's already broken out in my eyes based on his rookie season peripheral numbers. And by the way, his underdog ADP backs me up. You know, he's going in the early second round. That's typically a place that we reserve for players that we are pretty sure are very good. Zamir White and Romeo Dobbs were third round rookie picks that I haven't really had any luck trading away. And then Rashid Shaheed I picked up off of waivers. But otherwise, we have a lot of rookies in Caleb Williams, Ladd McConkey, Brian Thomas Jr., Marshawn Lloyd, Jalen Polk. I like rostering rookies because they keep my team young. I have the chance to really gain a lot of trade value if one of these guys explodes. And generally speaking, rookies are afforded a lot more value insulation, a lot more leeway than year 2 and year 3 players. If they struggle out of the gate, I'm going to have more opportunities to trade them away if that's what I want to do, or hold on to them and see what happens throughout the season. But I also have some older players, and this is a direct result of my last choice. If I'm de-emphasizing these young non-rookies, well, I can't form a lineup entirely out of young elite players, and I can't really start a lot of rookies if I expect to win. So I need to get point scorers somewhere else. And that typically comes in the form of these older productive veterans. I think this asset class is generally undervalued. And I think that we can exploit that to actually keep our competing windows open longer. And I know it sounds counterintuitive, even nonsensical to think that buying older players would keep our window open longer, but it actually works because these older players are just too cheap relative to younger players that also have question marks. The risk of older players is obvious. They have shorter shelf lives and their value could go to zero, leaving you with a dead asset. But in most cases, that risk is entirely factored into the price. Like the price that you're getting on the player already presupposes that that's going to happen. Just look at Derrick Henry, who earlier this offseason, you could buy for a second round pick pretty easily. Now his price is creeping up because as we get closer to the season, these veteran players that are expected to score a lot of points, they become more expensive. But even now, he's still being traded for second round picks in a number of leagues. Now think about what can happen investing a second round pick in Derrick Henry. Well, the first and the worst outcome is that Derrick Henry as a 30-year-old running back is totally washed and he provides you with no value or very little value this season, and then he goes to zero, right? And at that point, you've totally wasted a second round pick, which is unfortunate, but it's not going to kill you. Second round picks bust all the time. If you draft a rookie in the second round that doesn't pan out, you don't typically have to rebuild your team, right? It's a pretty low risk investment at that point. Now think about another possible outcome. What if Derrick Henry just comes out and does exactly what his underdog ADP suggests that he's going to do, which is score a bunch of touchdowns for the Ravens, finish as an RB1? Well, that is a slam dunk use of a second round pick. If you could just trade your second round pick every year for an RB1 and get RB1 production, you should do that because the odds are most years, the player you take in the second round will never have a season as impactful as that one singular season. But there's also a third outcome that I would argue is not factored into the price whatsoever, which is what if Henry just doesn't go away after this season? What if he's just a good fit in this scheme? What if he's still good because he's an athletic freak? What if he gives you 2 RB1 seasons? Or he gives you an RB1 season this year and an RB2 season next year? That's just highway robbery for the price of a second round pick. And I do not think that that's being factored in. So what I'm saying is that Henry being a 1-year rental is totally baked into his price. If he dies on your roster, you're not losing that much. And there's this upside that's not being priced in that you could potentially use him and resell him after the season, or that you could just get these extra years out of him that are essentially free. Now, maybe you can't get Henry for that in every league. That's fine. I know his price is on the rise. But what about players like Mike Evans or Cooper Kupp or Amari Cooper or Keenan Allen, Alvin Kamara, Aaron Jones, Joe Mixon? These are all different versions of the same bet, and the odds are at least one of those guys is available in your league. My dad recently bought a circular saw, and he looked at Home Depot. He didn't like the $120 price tag, so he went over to Harbor Freight and he bought a circular saw for $37. Will that $37 saw last as long as the Home Depot version? Probably not. But he can replace that saw 3 times before he actually has to pay as much as he would have paid for that one Home Depot saw. And that is how I view these productive veterans in Dynasty. I like rostering some of these older players in Dynasty because the market is really baking in the age risk. The fact that they could go to 0 on my roster. Yeah, they're going to wear out sooner, but they're also really inexpensive to replace. So what you can do is build a core of young difference-making players, and then you can compete for years with this rotating cast of veterans that nobody wants. And all the while, you get to keep adding young talent through the draft because you don't have to ship off your valuable picks, your first-round picks, to get point scorers that you can put in your lineup. I think DeAndre Hopkins is the best example of this in Dynasty right now. I mentioned him as a trade target in my last video. He's one of my most rostered wide receivers. His startup ADP is in the 13th round. He's going after wide receivers like Jahan Dotson and Roman Wilson and Khalil Shakir. Like the Dynasty community has left him for dead. They're not even leaving a lot of room for him to have a good season in 2024, which I think is crazy. He looked great in ESPN Open Score last year. He had a high target share. He had incredibly high air yards. He had his highest yards per route run, I think, in a few seasons. Yeah, he's entering his age 32 season, but we haven't actually seen any evidence that he's not good anymore. He just played on a team last year that had bad quarterback play and didn't throw the ball. And maybe he'll have bad quarterback play again this year, but all signs point to a much more pass-heavy offense. So at his cost, which is basically a third-round rookie pick, the Dynasty market isn't really factoring in any kind of impact in 2024. Yet he's being drafted as a top 40 wide receiver on Underdog, so basically low-end wide receiver 3 territory. And I think he has upside for more than that if Will Levis is competent at all. So now compare that to a player like Jameson Williams, who's going after Hopkins on Underdog, but well ahead of him in Dynasty. Now, you can certainly argue that Jameson Williams should be more valuable than DeAndre Hopkins in Dynasty because of his age. If he breaks out this year, he's going to have a lot more usable seasons than DeAndre Hopkins. And if he breaks out this year, he is going to gain in Dynasty value. And I totally agree with both of those statements. If Jameson Williams comes out this season and he can earn volume for the first time in his NFL career, yes, he is going to gain value and he is going to be an ascending asset. But what I'm saying is I just generally like to avoid that archetype of player, these non-rookie breakout candidates, because I think the market undersells the risk. If Jameson Williams comes out this year and does what he has done through his first 2 seasons, he will be borderline worthless by October. In other words, I am content missing out on the theoretical upside of a Jameson Williams type if instead I can have somebody like DeAndre Hopkins, and then I can just pocket the difference in value in the form of rookie picks or some other young player. In a trade scenario, give me DeAndre Hopkins and a second over Jameson Williams and a third any day of the week. But it doesn't have to be a straight swap like that. It doesn't have to be Hopkins for Jameson Williams. It's just about consciously offloading these uninspiring year 2 and year 3 profiles whenever the opportunity arises to sell them, and then backfilling those holes with cheap productive veterans. And it doesn't even have to be super old players. You can do this with the likes of Christian Kirk and Chris Godwin and Deontay Johnson. The idea is that you are minimizing downside with these particular roster spots. You're locking in these starters where they're known commodities. You know what they're going to give you. Their value upside isn't as high, but that's okay because hopefully you have some young elite players on your team that are highly valuable and you get to keep your rookie picks. And so you can use those as a way to try to boost your team's value. It's almost like you're segmenting your players to have 2 different purposes where it's like, these are my players that are going to score points and these are the assets that are going to gain value. It's not actually as simple as that in practice, but that's kind of what you're doing. Whereas taking one of these young breakout candidates, you're saying, no, this guy's going to do both for me. He's going to actually score points and help me win games and at the same time gain a lot of value. And that's just often a riskier proposition. I do want to offer a word of caution to not overdo it with this strategy. You don't want to just go out and buy all the old players. If your team is Christian McCaffrey and Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce and Stephon Diggs and Devontae Adams, you are going to find yourself with a very low value team in a very short amount of time. And then you're going to be backed into that corner of rebuilding anyway. So the idea here is to get a couple of these veterans to fill some of those starting spots, ideally the cheap ones, and then use that as a way to help you contend for a buy while still maintaining a lot of young, valuable players. Anyway, that'll do it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We are pushing towards 2,000 subs, and go check out that playlist that I linked in the description. It's about an hour of Dynasty strategy content just like this. Please leave a comment if you have any questions about today's video, or just leave me a topic for a future video and I'll try to get to it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.